Alright, CX500 first.
I'll go first if you want. Just expect me to slow down in weird places.
Well, you should probably lead since Jason takes us the wrong way immediately at the front.
So I finally got some video riding the CX500, doing some off-road riding here. This is part of the Stoney Lonesome Buffaloe dual sport ride. A local club down here in southern Indiana puts this ride on every year. It's part of the AMA National Dual Sport Series, I believe. 2-day ride, and it's a dual sport, but it's really a dirt bike ride that happens to have road connectors in between it, kind of like an untimed enduro. It's not a competition, it's not a race, it's just a bunch of people locally who have very kindly opened up their properties to us to allow us to ride this kind of once a year loops through their properties over the course of this weekend. So it draws dirt bikes from all around, and there is an adventure bike class, I guess, that's separate loops that are back roads through the Hoosier National Forest, through southern Indiana, which is a lot of great riding, but not hard off-road. So this video, the bike I'm riding is a 1980 Honda CX500 Deluxe. And this was a bike that I had picked up for a cheap bike challenge that a bunch of friends and I had decided to do. And so this is a $1,000 bike build that I'd put together. And it's obviously not a stock CX500 anymore. The front end of it, as you can see, is not old forks. They are 1998 RM250 closed chamber, 49 millimeter conventional forks. They've been shortened to 4 inches, so they're now about 7.5 inches of travel. Stiffer springs. I put some thicker fork oil in it rather than revalving them, so they do pretty well. I bottomed them out a couple times, but considering it's a 420 pound bike, I think they do just fine. The wheels are stock 19 inch in the front and a 17 inch in the rear that I put together from a Goldwing rim and then the CX500 hub, because of course the CX500 is shaft drive.
I need better brakes.
You hear me say I need better brakes. The front brake is the stock crappy single disc, and the rear is a drum. And the engine on these bikes is kind of a unique engine. It's water cooled. It's an 80-degree V-twin that's mounted longitudinally instead of transverse like they are in most chain drive bikes. 5-speed transmission. It's actually got pretty darn good ratios for off-road, which is fortunate since you can't re-gear a shaft drive bike very easily. It does really well. Most of the time I'm in second and third. The rear suspension is stock swing arm and everything, but I do have longer shocks. They are the front shocks off of a Polaris 800 XC snowmobile. And they've been modified a little bit to make them softer. They're still way too stiff. I got about 6 inches of travel in the back, so it's 7.5 front, 6.5 in the rear. The engine's got a huge flywheel on it. It's very nearly impossible to stall, but it does make it rev pretty slowly when you're cruising down these dirt gravel roads like this. And of course the brakes, and I've got like a Tractionator Adventure front tire and a D606 rear, so the rear's got pretty good grip. The front, not so much. It washes pretty bad. Being that this is a street bike, in the video I'm standing, I've got the GoPro on a chest mount. The CX500 is not made to stand on, it's made to sit. It's a street bike. The gas tank is very, very long, and I had to move it back another 1.5 inches just to clear the forks. So the riding position is just, it's not great. Your feet stick way out there. You got to watch your toes constantly. So you work pretty hard to stand. It's actually a decent kind of hunched over attack position once you get used to it. There's just nothing to grab with your knees. These downhills are pretty hard on those forks using what little travel I have. And because the rear suspension's so stiff, getting over logs like that is, when the back wheel hits it, the suspension really doesn't move very much at all. But it's a hilarious bike to ride on this stuff. And you can see it can carry pretty good speed. It just wears you out. I mean, a dirt bike would cruise through this and soak everything up. The carburetors on the engine are still the stock CV carbs. They're kind of goofy on this bike. They've got 2 main circuits. There's one that's just an open jet, and then there's one that's actually got a needle in it like a typical carburetor would have. And there is actually an accelerator pump too, so the throttle response is pretty good. I didn't have issues with slide bounce. I didn't have issues with float bounce or floats flooding, so really overall pretty impressed. Obviously not going to make the greatest power for this stuff, but did just fine. Way better than any street bike carb should. It's very easy to overshoot corners. The brakes are just not great. I even put a different master cylinder on it that has a smaller piston to try to get the hydraulic ratio in line, and it still wasn't enough. Every once in a while you dump it. It's 420-pound bike. It isn't the easiest thing to pick up. But then I started knocking the fuel line off with my knee. Just from standing, your knee ends up right next to the petcock. And I had too short of a fuel line on there and knocked it off a half dozen times the first day and a couple more times again the second day. It's great because it dumps fuel all over your foot and all over the exhaust. I've got both headers running out the front of the cylinder heads, and they come over to the left side of the bike. So all that fuel just drains straight onto a hot collector. The bike makes roughly 45 to 50 horsepower is what they say they do from the factory, new back in 1980. This engine does have something like 20,000 miles on it. It seems to run well, has good compression, starts well, but that peak power is made at 9,000 RPM, and it's a nice linear build up to that, but off the bottom there's not a lot of go. It sounds good though. There is no tach on this bike. I've got what's called an Ignitec. It's a computerized ignition system that actually, this bike was a conglomeration of 2 CX500s and an RM250, and one of my CX500s had this Ignitec unit on it, which was great because not only does it solve some of the ignition problems of the early CX500s, it's got a rev limiter and a shift light in it, so I could minimize my gauges, just have a shift light. With the Adventure front tire on it, it's really easy to push that front end, and the tank being so long, you sit kind of over the rear wheel, over the swing arm pivot, and so when the bike starts to slide, it gets away from you so fast because your whole body moves with it if you're sitting down. It's not like a dirt bike where when you're standing on the pegs, you're kind of up forward over the bars. That body position is not accessible on a CX500. So you get really used to kind of babying the front end through stuff, and you don't slide the back. Because when it hooks, it's not very forgiving at all. The clutch, surprisingly, like this thing's got the smallest clutch on it because it is a street bike. The clutch actually did really well. I never had to adjust it. I was thinking about it the whole time, trying not to use the clutch, trying to keep my speed up enough that I didn't have to slip it. Fortunately, that giant flywheel helps with that a lot. But never had to adjust it. It did fine. It never got hot. Of course, I'm not, fanning it coming out of corners. I'm not racing the bike, but this is way worse abuse than any Honda designer ever intended the bike to go through. The later bikes, the CX650 and the turbo bikes, had a much larger clutch, with a higher torque capacity. So I've got it in the back of my head that I could always upgrade to that if I need to, but it doesn't seem to be a need so far. The stock throttle on these bikes is, most modern bikes have a 90-degree throttle on them. The stock throttle on this is probably like 130-degree throttle. You really can't get full throttle, which is a problem when you're riding off-road and you've got minimal power off the bottom. You really want to get those carbs going, give it a good amount of throttle whenever you get into it. So I took the RM250 throttle and rigged up the setup to make it work with the CX500 carbs, and the throttle pull is now, it's extremely hard. The turn is pretty rough, but it's now, instead of even being a 90-degree throttle, it's like a 75-degree throttle, and so you can watch my hand, and I'm basically just on and off the throttle. There's very little just balancing it. Off-road, you either want it all or you don't. Because off the bottom it just doesn't make as much power as it could. It definitely surprised some people in the woods. The bike did way better than I was expecting for a cheap bike build, and it's been a lot of fun. It was not a bike I intended to get attached to. I've always kind of wanted to build a CX500, and I have a thing for V-twins. I do have the KTM 950 Adventure as well, but I think this one's going to stick around. It's turned out to be a ton of fun, and on the street, it's a blast to ride too. Having less power, you can just, you can beat on the thing, and you're still not breaking any laws. I did drop the bike a few times. The second day of the Buffalo, I kind of took it out of commission. I bent a footpeg. I went past a pile of logs a little bit too fast and caught a peg on it and bent the peg up real bad. And also discovered at the same time that the vibration of riding this thing hard off-road had broken both of the spark plug boots. They're kind of brittle plastic after they've been heat cycled for 40 odd years, and they just came apart in pieces. And so I was able to limp the thing home, got it back, and got one of my other bikes out and rode the rest of it the second day, which there's also a video on YouTube of that. You can see some of these trails, what it looks like on the Husqvarna FC450 that I normally race. After riding the CX, you can ride hard like this for a day. I was so sore the second day from just the suspension not really moving very much. It just beating the crap out of me. The bike also doesn't have real handguards on it, so as I'm dodging these trees, it's always in the back of my head that I've just got a little piece of plastic that looks cool, but if I hit one of those trees, it's going to go straight into my hand. The bike never got hot, amazingly, so it also did pretty well there. I did add an electric fan, but overall, it's been great. And if you're curious to know more about the bike, there is a build thread over on the CX500 forums. My screen name's the same as on YouTube, Gearhead E30. Go check it out, all the details of the build, bunch of pictures, and other cool stuff over there.